Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Late to the game. Okay, we are covering Venom Volume 1. We are so late to this. We're covering Venom Volume 1. I'm calling this the God Butcher symbiote. 1, because it's clickbait, and 2, it sounds cooler, and 3, because it's true. So, Venom by Donny Cates is ridiculously good, right? Like it's one of the coolest things. It's the best thing coming out of Marvel Legacy right now, which isn't hard to do. So with regards to this whole thing, this again really kind of focuses on Eddie Brock, but this is cool. It's an expansion of the Venom mythos, but it's not a retcon. For those of you guys who are new to comics, here's one thing comic book fans hate. When a writer creates something cool, like for all the people who say they hate Brian Michael Bendis, it's kind of ironic because like they like the stuff he does, which is kind of cool. They're like, I hate Brian Michael Bendis, but only under certain circumstances, right? It's like Brian Michael Bendis did like a wholesale revitalization of like the Venom mythos when it came to like the symbiotes and all that kind of stuff and Guardians of the Galaxy during the Planet Symbiote storyline. What Donny Cates does here is he ties into Jason Aaron's run on Thor, he ties into Brian Michael Bendis's Planet Symbiote story in Guardians of the Galaxy, and then he ties into the existing Venom mythos, and then actually like sort of brings all those things together and then expands on it at the same time, which is something that's very hard to do. And that's how you kind of know that like Donny Cates is like a comic book reader, right? Because you have people who write comics and don't really read them all that often, and then you have people who like have just read comics for a long time and then write into it, which works exceedingly well, the ones who do their research. And so what this does is this initially kind of picks up with Eddie Brock getting like these flashes to like a time before he existed when like some kind of Venom symbiote was like attacking things and tearing up like this Norwegian town and all that kind of good stuff where they're hauling for Beowulf and whatnot, who actually did exist in Marvel Comics. But these are flashbacks to a life that Eddie Brock never lived. Now, when a symbiote bonds itself to a host and then leaves that host and bonds itself to someone else, the memories of the original host come along with it. And so basically what Eddie Brock is doing is having flashbacks to either what are his original memories from the Venom symbiote or are the memories of something else. And this is what Donny Cates kind of expands on when it comes to the symbiote mythos. And again, we'll talk more about that here in a second. But what's going on is that at the moment, the Venom symbiote's kind of losing its mind, right? Like it's reverting into like a psychopathic state and then regaining itself. So it's really just kind of like going absolutely bonkers, going insane. And the way this plays out is when Eddie Brock basically tracks down the new Jack-O-Lantern. Now, the new Jack-O-Lantern is a plot point here. He's not really important, and he just kind of serves to progress the story. And the reason why is because when Eddie tracks that version of this new version of Jack-O-Lantern down, the symbiote goes crazy and then tries to kill Jack-O-Lantern. And so that's when Eddie Brock really kind of regains control when he's attacked by the cops and sort of regains his bearings, you know, when an explosion goes off and everything. And we end up finding out that all this has kind of been set up by Rex Strickland. Now, Rex Strickland is a wholly new character created by Donny Cates. He's really kind of brought in here. This is his first appearance. And what's really kind of given right off the bat is that he's a guy that basically knows his way around symbiotes. And so what's kind of going on here is Rex Strickland really sits down with Eddie Brock and says, you believe that you're the only person to wield a Venom symbiote on Earth besides Peter Parker, besides Spider-Man, but that's not true. Instead, what happened was somewhere along the line, S.H.I.E.L.D. got their hands on Venom symbiotes and then bonded them to soldiers and used them for the purpose of implementing campaigns. And so S.H.I.E.L.D. got their hands on them. They basically bonded them to soldiers, or I guess people who were former soldiers were essentially on their deathbeds, and then they were just kind of sent out into the world. And so what's cool about this is that this guy, Rex Strickland, basically says his former teammates had basically gone insane because of their symbiotes. Now, again, this is kind of intriguing here, because one of the things that was sort of touched on early on in the days of Spider-Man, and then actually kind of confirmed during a What If comic, is that if a symbiote stayed bonded to a host for too long, it would drive them insane and then consume them. And so Rex Strickland's idea is his teammates who had basically been bonded to the Venom symbiotes and then basically went insane are being taken to like one of these Black Ops sites by S.H.I.E.L.D., and then they're going to be eliminated. And presumably the Venom symbiotes are going to be taken, examined, or what have you, but what are basically the friends of Rex Strickland are going to be killed off. The problem is that they're essentially insane. And so Rex Strickland has hit up Venom for the purpose of saying, you're the only guy who can track these guys down. So when that happens and Venom finally does that, the problem is that once these guys emerge, they basically kind of wake up this quote unquote symbiote god, not really understanding what it is, but speaking this kind of crazy language that the crazy Venom symbiote speaks whenever it seems to go awry. So again, a lot of cloak and dagger going on in this first little issue here. But when the whole thing comes to a close, and that is to say these guys basically escape, they wake up this force that's up there, this force strips them of their symbiotes and then emerges as like a giant bat kind of thing. And so it's sort of cool here because initially, like immediately what happens is you literally have like the Venom symbiote kind of fixing Eddie Brock from the various pieces of damage that he suffered and then trying to track down, or at least going back to Rex Strickland and basically saying, give us the whole picture, tell us what's really going on here. And so what Rex essentially says is that, again, kind of re-hitting on this whole thing about S.H.I.E.L.D. and about the idea of like the Venom symbiote being bonded to him, that when his symbiote was bonded to him, what he got was kind of this recollection of everything that had happened in the universe since its very beginning, all the way up to the present day, and everything the symbiote had been doing. And so again, it can really go one of two ways. And again, we'll find out what direction Donny Cates is going on here, but it can go one of two ways. Either the symbiote of Rex Strickland is getting memories to an event it wasn't part of, meaning it's getting the memories of other symbiotes, or the symbiote that belonged to Rex Strickland really had just been around that long, and basically Rex has all these recollections from everything this symbiote had ever done. And so it's kind of cool here because it's basically expanding on this whole great big huge set of events. And so again, like with Venom showing up alongside Miles Morales and fighting this giant symbiote dragon that kind of exists out there, there's not a whole lot going on here. I mean, there is a little bit insofar as what Miles does with regards to the fact that he has that Venom, that Venom shock, which again is basically just like an electrical shock, where it manages to quote unquote damage Eddie Brock to a degree. Eddie kind of wakes up to the idea of saying, if the Venom shock of Spider-Man, of Miles, works against me, then if he can basically amp it up, if he can juice it up, use it to its max capacity, he could presumably take this thing out. And that's exactly what Miles does. The two of them kind of orchestrate a plan. They pull a little bit of a fastball special and literally like land Miles in the mouth of this giant monster thing when it goes to attack him. And he uses, of course, his Venom shock, blows it up, only for us to realize that what is kind of done is reconstituted this being of sorts. Now this is cool because when this being shows up, it's literally like, you're outmatched and you guys don't have a chance. And it's kind of a cool thing. And the reason why is because what this guy does, of course, once he reveals his name as being Null, what he does is seize control of the symbiote of Eddie Brock. Like he literally strips the symbiote off of Eddie and says, come to me and do as I tell you to. And it's kind of crazy because it creates this kind of field around the two of them, around Spider-Man and around Eddie, around the symbiote and itself. And then basically kind of goes on this sort of discussion with the symbiote proper. And this is kind of cool because what happens here is Donny Cates writes this in such a way to where Null kind of presents himself as this being that's well aware of what the symbiote is, that knows everything about the symbiote, and even identifies to it in such a way as saying, you've been corrupted by humanity. Now, this is where Donny Cates starts to tie into the idea of Brian Michael Bendis. This is where he starts to tie into what Bendis did with the Planet of the Symbiote storyline. So again, not wiping all that away, because while Bendis is really kind of being looked at least it seems being looked at by Marvel, as kind of, hey, you went to the competition, you're a bad guy now, and they're systematically sort of wiping away everything Bendis did. The fact that Donny Cates throws this into the Venom story means now it's here to stay. But the way that this kind of goes down is Null basically grabs Eddie Brock and then sort of shows him the history of himself. And this is cool because we get basically Jason Aaron's God Butcher storyline all thrown in with Brian Michael Bendis' storyline that sort of ties into the origin of the universe. But when it came to Null himself, he's the result of the destruction of a previous universe and the creation of a new one. Now, we're not told explicitly how. The way it seems to kind of play out is sometime between the death of the old universe and the beginning of whatever this new one happens to be, that Null came into existence. We don't really know how, but he existed in this empty void that became the formation of a new universe. And so when the Celestials started creating stars and planets and solar systems and galaxies and different things like that, they were filling up the void that housed Null with all kinds of life. And so basically Null woke up and war between them broke out. The issue with this is that Null didn't really seemingly know how to defeat a Celestial right off the bat. I mean, he did to a degree in the sense that he fashioned a sword and then basically killed them or chopped off the head of one of them. But following that and following his defeat where he was cast back into the void again kind of hinting at the idea that he originates from outside of this universe, somewhere out in the multiverse, that what Null did is he fashioned what was called the all-black Necro Sword. Now, this is where we start tying into Jason Aaron's Thor, because for those of you guys who read God Butcher, we didn't know where the all-black Necro Sword came from. What Donny Cates is doing here is kind of providing the back end of that and saying that when Null had essentially faced off and decapitated one of the Celestials and was banished by the rest of them, he created the all-black Necro Sword and then went on a campaign literally fighting every god that he came across and just inflicting death and destruction everywhere he could. And when that happened, he ultimately came across one being, the two of them fought each other, and when they effectively killed each other, they landed on the planet that belonged to Gore. And Gore, discovering their bodies, picked up the all-black Necro Sword, not really knowing what it was capable of. So again, it's cool because what this does is kind of tie in. It really sort of ties together a lot of these little plot points that had kind of been floating out there in Marvel Comics with regards to other people's work. And so following this, what ended up happening with Null is that he basically sort of reawoke on this planet that he was on, but realized he could bond his life essence to other beings, essentially becoming the first symbiote. And when that happened, he basically began to sort of corral all these different concepts that existed out there, sort of creating symbiotes symbiotes or creating a kind of hive mind, and then literally saw all of them from across the universe. So through a kind of seat of power, he could watch the universe and watch how his symbiotes were interacting with other races and other beings that went out there, and then essentially just kind of like control them in and of himself. And so what ended up happening is that when he arrived on Earth, that his connection to all these symbiotes that existed out there was disrupted when he fought Thor, and Thor, literally using the power of lightning as one of the weaknesses of the symbiotes, kind of cut off the connection between Null and these various symbiotes that existed across the universe. And so again, because all this happened presumably billions of years ago, countless years ago, what this does is it back ends to Brian Michael Bendis' Planet of the Symbiotes. And it says that following the defeat of Null in the Planet Symbiote storyline that was created by Bendis, all these symbiotes took up residence on a singular planet. Now, the way that Null kind of plays this off is we view it as a planet, but really it's just a gathering of the largest horde of symbiotes. In reality, there are other symbiotes that exist in other places across the entirety of the universe, but the brunt of them exists on that singular planet. And so we kind of have to assume the way that Bendis writes it and the way that Donny Cates writes this, we can kind of combine the two of them together and say, well, from Null's perspective, the symbiotes really just kind of gathered in a singular place. But the way that Bendis writes it, the symbiotes kind of came together and formed a sort of a role that they played where they basically became kind of knights of the universe, which is to say that what they would do is they would bond themselves to a singular host. And when that happened, that host would become a kind of savior of the universe, or at least a section of the universe akin to like the Green Lanterns from DC. But a symbiote could be corrupted by a singular being. The way that Donny Cates writes this is he kind of says that's not really the case. Instead, what happens is the inherent nature of a symbiote is to be dark. It is to be evil because that's what it originates from. And so where Bendis would say these symbiotes can bond themselves, and much like the Venom version on Earth basically became corrupted by Eddie Brock, what actually happened is the Venom symbiote touched the light, so to speak, touched the good guy and became a good guy when it bonded itself to Peter Parker. So basically it betrayed its nature when it joined Peter Parker and became a good guy, and then when it left Peter and joined Eddie, it reverted back to its normal nature and became a bad guy. That's way back in the early days. Along the way, the Venom symbiote has started to become a good guy again. And so it's kind of cool because what it does is it takes the entire concept of Venom as we know it and flips it on its head. Instead of believing the Venom symbiote is inherently a good guy who became a bad guy because of Venom and then became a good guy again, which was its normal part, then instead the Venom symbiote was always a bad guy. And then it became a good guy with Peter, it went back to its normal nature with Eddie, and then it's been working its way to try to become a good guy ever since. It's been betraying its nature this entire time. And so that's kind of the cool thing here. It works exceedingly well. And so what this does is it hits home at the idea that with Null basically returning, what he's done is restored his connection to the various symbiotes that exist out there, and then intends to kind of go on a conquest and sort of go ballistic and so on and so forth. But what it's been doing is really kind of saying, okay, this Null as we see him now is actually just a symbiote. The actual Null exists out there on a planet somewhere and is just kind of waiting to be reborn and to return itself. But in order for Null to actually return, for the actual Null to come back, what it needs like a fifth missing piece, basically saying that like the other four soldiers, the other four symbiotes that it absorbed when it first popped up as a giant bat looking thing, that's 4 out of 5 pieces of a puzzle. It needs a fifth piece, and then Null himself will actually return. And when that happens, the indication is the universe could presumably be doomed because of the massive amount of power that Null possesses. And so it's kind of cool here because basically with this whole thing unfolding, kind of going down the way that it is, this leads to Venom symbiote telling Eddie Brock, because of the fact that we've encountered this Null symbiote, what it means is that now we have a host of power. So it's kind of a way for Donny Cates to introduce new abilities to Venom by just sort of saying, hey, this part of his symbiote has been unlocked, more or less. But when Venom, when Eddie Brock sits down and starts to think about everything that's been going on, what he does is realize not everything is what it seems, especially if like the fifth piece of this Grendel, basically this kind of missing pieces have to all be brought back together. The fifth one is here for a reason because like Null is looking for it. And so what he ends up doing is traveling back to Rex Strickland and basically saying, give me the whole story. And that's when we find out this is not actually Rex Strickland. Instead, this is the symbiote of Rex Strickland. That somewhere along the line, Rex Strickland himself had basically died. That when the symbiote bonded to Rex, that it basically became a good guy, and much the same way that the symbiote did when it bonded to Flash Thompson originally, and then is now kind of back to Eddie Brock, that it's basically a good guy here, that because Rex had died, the symbiote kind of continued on in his image. And so this symbiote was originally part of the whole, part of the horde of Null, and in order for Null to come back, this symbiote is kind of like the last missing piece that needs to be bonded with the Null symbiote in order for that Null symbiote to travel back to the home planet of the symbiotes, and then for Null to finally rise. And so that's when they sort of bond together, when Eddie says the only way for you to truly be safe is to bond yourself to me. And when that happens, everything will be fine, like everything will be okay. And so with the two of them basically bonding together and working together as a singular unit, they look pretty awesome. They look pretty badass. But it's basically Eddie with all the new powers he got from touching Null, along with all the existing powers he got from the Rex Strickland symbiote. So again, it's pretty awesome here. It's basically kind of combining combining all these different abilities together. The problem with this is that with them facing off against this null version of the symbiote, it's wildly powerful. Like it's extremely capable and not easily destroyed. And so Eddie showing up here is kind of like, okay, look, we can't really defeat it in and of ourselves. Like at the most, we're a stopgap measure, because what this null, again, what null does is kind of try to tap into the symbiote of Rex and the Venom version, and it actually cannot control them. And so because it cannot control them, the response is, well, then I'll just kill the host and I'll take them forcefully. And so again, trying to kill Eddie, it's Eddie basically like blasting him with like sonic bombs, sonic grenades, and so on and so forth. And then it kind of begins to wrap up relatively fast, insofar that what ends up happening is a Venom symbiote basically says, the only way for you to really win is to use the one absolute weakness, which is fire. And so in this instance, Eddie grabs Null and just kind of like forces him into like this furnace, basically, and where Null kind of tries to latch on and tries to get out and so on and so forth. It's literally burning the Venom symbiote and then burning Null along with the Rex Strickland symbiote, kind of burning them all at the same time. And so where Eddie himself is actually on fire and not really looking to like sacrifice or lose his own symbiote in the process, the symbiote in turn bonds to Eddie, because where the symbiote like jumps off like, oh my god, it's fire, I gotta go. Eddie says, no, you have to come back, you have to keep me alive here in order to make sure that like Null dies, basically asking the Venom symbiote to sacrifice itself. And that's exactly what happens. The Venom symbiote rebonds itself to Eddie, keeps him alive long enough to keep the door closed, and then in turn, while he's laying there, the Venom symbiote basically seems to have been killed. It seems to have been eliminated by the fact that Eddie can't really hear it anymore. So again, it's a cool story. I'm surprised it took me so long to cover this thing. Donnie Cates, dude, okay, so his Venom symbiote, Venom run is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.